Welcome to Tales from the Bridge. We've got a great episode today. We're talking to Damien Walter. Great conversation. Every Wednesday for the next few weeks, we've got an episode coming out. So in a few weeks, we've got a chat with John Scalzi. Next week, Sue Burke is on the show. So please check out the episodes on Wednesdays. Right now, we're talking to Damien. Check out DamienGWalter.com. You're going to like his podcast, but he's waiting for us right now. Let's make our way over to the bridge.
Very pleased to have with us today on our podcast Damien Walter, who we discovered through his Facebook page. His science fiction is the Facebook page's name, where he kindly allows us to occasionally promote our podcast, and which quickly led to our discovery of everything else he does. He has a science fiction podcast, which has been taking off like the proverbial rocket. I've been listening to his episodes throughout the holidays, where he tackles a very broad range of science fiction topics and broad range of creators, embracing our tagline, all things science fiction, even better than we do. So he talks about storytellers in the broadest sense, from authors to directors to artists and composers, from books to TV to movies. Damien has what he has done, I think, as his main career till now is teaching good writers to be great. So he's been published in The Guardian, in Wired, BBC, The Independent, Eon, and with the Oxford University Press. He's a former director of creative writing at the University of Leicester and a member of the Higher Education Academy. He also is a graduate of the Clarion Workshop, taught by Neil Gaiman, which we will have to definitely ask you about. He consults widely for businesses in technology, healthcare, and manufacturing to help them tell great stories. So thank you for being here with us, Damien, and let's talk about stories.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marty. Thanks, guys. It's really a pleasure to be invited onto your podcast. And I hope I haven't argued with any of you on the science fiction group, because we do sometimes get a few heated arguments on that. But
Not yet.
We've come to agreement.
Oh, we love that. That's great. Not yet. I don't think so. Although I think you have been a good influence on me, because my Facebook existence is kept very private within my friend group. So I have a habit of going off the hook and saying exactly what I want to say. And it's been actually very nice to be part of a very, very large group with you, to be a little bit more moderated and polite and, watch my tone. But I am glad that you guys get into some heated arguments once in a while. I love to see it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that group has been a real kind of mission. We set it up, I think, like 4 or 5 years ago now, and I'd found myself trying to interact on a lot of the big forums about science fiction, and there are just certain conversations that you couldn't really have on those groups. Especially if you wanted to think critically about science fiction or in a broader context, that there would usually be some people in the group who just didn't want to have that conversation. And I found myself thrown out of a couple of groups that I didn't really consider to be a very good reason. So I thought, I'm just going to set up a group. And initially, for the first 18 months, it was me and about 100 other people who kind of knew my work from The Guardian and stuff, and we would chat. And now, 5 years on, we've got about that many people a day joining the group. We're just heading towards 10,000 members at the moment.
Wow. Well, that's inspiring. I mean, it has been amazing to see just how fast your group is growing and how fast your podcast is growing. Maybe we could just start. Would you tell us a little bit about your podcast? I've been listening to lots of the episodes, really enjoying it. Can you just tell us how long you've been doing it, how it started, how it's going?
Yeah. Well, I've been, writing and thinking about science fiction pretty much my whole life. I say I'm a third generation science fiction fan. My mum read me C.S. Lewis and Tolkien as a kid. My grandfather collected the books of H.G. Wells. There's quite a long generational gap between me and my grandfather. I just wanted to do loads of writing about science fiction. And over time, I had a blog, and that got me into writing for The Guardian and Wired and BBC, always about sci-fi or related topics. And then I took kind of a long break from science fiction because I was traveling around the world and actually studying a lot of meditation and stuff. And that ultimately brought me to Bali, where I am at the moment. And then about 2 years ago, kind of around when all of this craziness with COVID happened, I wanted to add a science fiction course to the courses that I teach. I teach courses online in writing and storytelling. So I started working on the advanced course in science fiction and fantasy because I really wanted to get into some like deep topics and ideas about the field. And I've been doing that over the last 2 years and building that online. And then I just started taking some of the content from that and putting it onto a podcast feed that I have on my WordPress site. I really enjoyed doing the podcast. And also I started using Clubhouse, which like got very popular for a short time and then seemed to die. But I was talking on there for like a few months. And I was really into having those audio conversations with people. So I decided that I would move some of that into the podcast as well and title it the Science Fiction Podcast, but try and talk widely about science fiction. So storytelling, but also where it crosses over into philosophy and social issues and politics, and also mix in a few like really cool interviews in there as well. So I've done one so far with self-published sci-fi author, Quantum, who's one of my favorite sci-fi authors I've discovered in the last 2 years. He was a brilliant discovery. He does have a real name, which you can find if you Google him, but I always use his pseudonym. And I've got some really good interviews coming up in the year ahead, which I can't quite reveal at the moment. But because the podcast has been charting, it was number 1 in the Apple Books chart in Costa Rica and in Finland. We hit number 6 in India, which is great. I have a lot of Indian students on my courses, and we were like number 25 in the UK and number 80 something in the United States. I think we have been in the Canada chart as well, but I can't remember the post. So because that's been getting increasingly successful and bringing in lots of listeners from the sci-fi group, I've had kind of publicists from the big sci-fi imprints approaching me, wanted to get authors on there to interview. So it's growing really fast. It's a really cool experience to do it as well. I'm just loving it at the moment.
Yeah, we are too, for sure. One thing that I like about having these groups is you learn a lot. In the short time that I've just been following your work, I'm learning. So to see your list of the 20th century is neat because there's a few names and titles on there I'm not aware of. But in the group itself, and one thing I just want to point out real quick is you got me the Christmas gift you got me, Damien, just came in the mail today. And let's see if you recognize this.
Oh, John Brunner.
So on
underestimated writer. Yes.
Yeah. So on Christmas Day, you shared this book. You said something along the lines of, without Shockwave Rider, there's no Neuromancer, and then there's no Matrix. So the first thing I did was grab this book because I like getting to the root of the idea. And I'm like that with music. If I hear this new band or whatever it is, I want to find out who did it first. I want to get to the beginning. And so nice. This just arrived actually just a few hours ago. So it's a neat little tidbit there. But I wouldn't have known about this book if I hadn't had. I mean, I might have come across it eventually, but it was nice to learn. So it's great that you're bringing that to a lot of people that like science fiction, that we're now able to share things. We hope we can share things with people too, to share new authors with people and new books. So thank you for that. And I look forward to learning and discovering so much more in the science fiction genre because this is the 21st century, and we're a sci-fi century, aren't we?
Yeah, we had a big discussion in the group actually about spoiler warnings for different media, and I basically said that like television shows, it's a very short time because you have to tune into the television show. It's your responsibility to know what's going on. Films a little bit longer, but books I think are an almost infinite spoiler warning length because people don't, even the biggest releases, except maybe like the fifth Harry Potter book or something, we don't all go and read the same book at the same time. So there is a big field of science fiction, and people who love science fiction, we kind of work our way around it over time. You know, I started very early, and I'm an enormous science fiction nerd, so I've read a lot of the field. But of course, for most people, it's something that we spend like our whole lives picking up new science fiction authors, learning new things about the field. So I'm glad I could introduce you to John Brunner.
Yeah.
A friend of mine, Jim Warad, who I've done podcasts with over the years as well. He actually owns John Brunner's typewriter. He has it in his house. Yeah, I can't remember. He won't tell me how much he paid for it now, so I assume it was a ridiculous sum of money.
Wow, that'd be very cool, though.
I like the idea of TV shows, spoilers, short period of time, movie a little bit longer, and books kind of in perpetuity, perhaps. But what about books, sci-fi books that have been made into TV shows? That's when things start getting confusing. Because I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Foundation series, because you made some comments on this. What did you think of that? Yeah,
I've been pretty vocal in slating the Foundation series. Why have they been doing that? Well, I think there's kind of two. It's been an amazing year for science fiction. Really, like, whoops, that was one of my cats just running.
We saw them behind you the whole time.
I was going to warn you that there's a jaguar that's ready to pounce on you. Yeah,
they look like tropical cats. They are not like Canadian fat cats.
No,
yours are thin.
What is with science fiction nerds and cats? Because we've spoken to multiple authors who have cats in the room, and
Elizabeth Bear had her cats going. Yeah.
We know that the cats are actually the species who control the planet. Right. They do it by controlling the significant thinkers and intellectuals, and they inhabit our spaces here. So, but yeah, it's been a great year for science fiction, primarily for me because of the Dune adaptation, which I was initially a bit skeptical of, but it was just amazing. And it's like, this is what you can do with science fiction with a big budget. And then the Foundation streaming show, I think it was just this massive lost opportunity. I refreshed my thinking about Asimov this year. I went back and I reread those books. And I think as a teenager, I'd only read the first 3, and they weren't very important books to me. And I reread them all this year. And I really loved them. Like, the writing is kind of clunky. It's not great storytelling, but the ideas are just epic and cosmic thinking about the future of humanity. And I think it was just a missed opportunity to not have those ideas in the television show, especially for a company like Apple, they are the foundation. They're the people making the high tech and leading us into the future, for better or worse. And I think the show could have been so much more. And it kind of boiled down to quite a typical adventure story with some quite nice sci-fi ideas, like about the cloning emperor. That's quite fun. But overall, if I wanted it to be a 90, it was kind of down in the 30s or 40s for me. So I felt a lot of personal disappointment. Apple actually disappointed me as a human being. But then, we've talked about it a lot in the group, and there's about half people who just say, oh, it was quite fun, so they like it on that level, which is totally they're entitled to do. But I'm going to continue giving it a bit of a beating because it cost a lot of money as well, and I feel we could spend that money better.
Well, I have to ask you, because this is something I've brought up a few times. As someone who's just reread the entire Foundation series, can I ask you, is the space elevator terrorist attack even in Foundation? Because it seemed to me they stole that straight out of Kim Stanley Robinson's Red Mars. That is a scene I remember vividly wanting to see on the big screen when I read it 20 years ago. I was like, oh my God, one day they'll make this into a movie and it'll be great. And then they made it into a movie, but they stuck it in Foundation. Was that scene even in Foundation?
Not as far as I remember. I wouldn't want to be caught out on that, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't.
Right.
And the terrorists aren't in there either. And, what they did, which I think missed the point, is that they turned the Galactic Empire into something like the Roman Empire. And it does have an emperor, but he's more of a figurehead. And what the Foundation is actually up against is like this huge bureaucracy. And it would be very difficult, especially to film the first book, because it is just men in rooms talking about the future and political arguments that they're having at the time. And I totally understand why they didn't just want to film it. It would have been cheaper. You could have just hired an office and put 2 actors in there. But I think there would have been ways to take those ideas and make them more exciting. But instead, they just abandoned all of the ideas. And science fiction is a literature of ideas. So why pick up Asimov if you're not going to pick up the ideas as well?
Well, I feel like what they did is they used Asimov as a marketing tool, as a, this is a big name brand, right? Like Dune or like, and then they just sort of riffed on it, right? They took some loose general themes, and then they started sticking in other people's scenes. And I kind of loved it. Like, just as watching, I'm one of those 50% that enjoyed it anyway. But I am a little bit offended and curious about, like, I really hope Kim Stanley Robinson got paid for that scene, because that's a precious scene to me. In my whole history of science fiction, that space elevator coming down, and wrapping itself around like a guillotine, around the planet, like, that is amazing. That has stuck in my mind for 20 years, 25 maybe. And, I want to know what happened. I just want to make sure. I want to know that they went to Kim Stanley Robinson and said, "Hey, listen, we love that scene. Can we pay you to use it in this completely different series that had nothing to do with you?" Anyway, we're going to talk to him. I think we're talking to Kim Stanley Robinson in the next few months, so we will ask him that question directly. Yeah, I'm
sure he'll give you a frank answer.
Oh, I'm sure he will.
A lot of the classic science fiction authors have had their ideas or their whole world basically ripped off. From what I've heard, the cyberpunk video game, the studio, is it CD Projekt Red, had approached William Gibson about using Neuromancer as a property, and he wasn't interested in doing it. So then they went and bought the role-playing game, which is largely based on his ideas. Anyway, so you can't protect your ideas in that way. People can take them, and there's a long way around it. Yeah.
So you mentioned this past year has been a really good year for science fiction, and you just did this 2-part epic podcast. What are some of your highlights from that? What are some of your faves?
Ever wondered what it takes to make it in the movie business? Peel back the curtain with 4-6 Success Filmmaking. 4-6 Success Filmmaking is where filmmakers share their stories and the secrets.
It's beyond competitive out there.
There have been movies that it's taken me 10 years to get made.
Don't wait to create. You've got to just keep making stuff.
Tune in to 4-6 Success Filmmaking for your dose of cinematic realness, direct from the voices that have lived it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the Dune adaptation. So I become, a Denis Villeneuve fanboy this year. He hadn't quite convinced me with Arrival, which I did like, but I know Ted Chiang a little bit, who wrote the original short story, and he's one of my kind of idols of short story writing. So I had him on my most influential of the last century as well.
Well, he was by far your highest rated author on that list.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, that's a good observation, actually, because I think a lot of what has happened in the field in this century is it's been very owned by genre ideas. So there have been people breaking out of there, and I selected kind of a more diverse set of authors. But I think the hard science fiction field has been kind of repeating itself. And Ted Chiang is one of the exceptions to that. Every one of his little short stories is like a diamond jewel. He takes ages to write them. When I've spoken to him about this, he basically says that he thinks about it and he adds a few sentences a day to a story. And then it's pretty much done when he stops doing that. And I'm sure he goes back and edits a bit, but that's his process. His stories just accrete over time. So that's the kind of thing I'm looking for. I'm looking for these kind of really great ideas, really high originality. So the author who I mentioned before, Quantum, I discovered his books this year, and that's a definite highlight of the year for me. And I think There Is No Anti-Memetics Division was published last year, finally in its collected form. So he put this story together as part of a big wiki, which you might have heard of. It's like you've obviously heard of wikis, but I think it's called the SCP project, and it kind of lots of different authors collaborating on the idea of there being like a CIA agency that deals with occult things appearing in the world. And a lot of it is very interesting, but Quantum stumbled on this idea of anti-memes. So we have the idea of the meme. This is the idea that's very good at copying itself. And he was thinking that there must be ideas that are impossible to copy. You can't even remember that you encountered the idea. So he riffs on this through a whole set of interlinked episodic stories. And the outcome is just this incredibly original book, really well written as well. So I keep plugging it wherever I'm talking to people. So, I've got Dune, Denis Villeneuve, Quantum, Ted Chiang a bit before this year, obviously. But, what I was trying to do in that list is look at like the trends of what's happening in science fiction. That's why I called it the most significant creators. So I was looking at, I should really have put more digital creators on there. I had Beeple on my list. So his work is like totally sci-fi when you see it. It's using like Buzz Lightyear figures and all of these other icons of sci-fi storytelling. And it's quite political as well. And he does what he calls kit bashing, which is a term that comes out of, if any of you guys do miniatures or wargaming, you take a bunch of kits and just bash them into something new. But he's doing this with digital models. So we have these like growing marketplaces, and you can just buy high-res digital models of almost anything. So he'll buy like Donald Trump's head and a castle and an astronaut and just bash them all together and then turn that into a work of art. And we have so much of this happening now, that so much of what was just in our imaginations in sci-fi is now in this unreal realm of the digital, and we can play with it and make worlds from it.
Well, you had a whole sorry to interrupt. You had a whole episode on the
on.
Unreal Engine, right? And you described a lot about what's going on with that.
Yeah.
Which is totally interesting and new. But also, I found that really interesting because what you point out is it's one thing to be able to make a painting, right? It's one thing to be able to make a digital world and like visual representations of as many cities and planets and environments as you want. But the hard part is the story, right? The meaning behind that. And that's what you talk a lot about, is storytelling and the craft of storytelling, which ultimately turns into, I think you said this in that episode, it's about meaning, right? It's about how do you add meaning to a world. It's what you can paint a world, you can make up a world, we can go walking around in a world and in these future digital worlds, the metaverse maybe that will occupy one day. It's all fun and games, but that only lasts so long, until you run out of meaning. And it's the storytellers that we need, right, to actually add that meaning to those worlds.
Yeah, one of the listeners to the podcast is he's a professional Unreal Engine designer, level designs and film, and he emailed me a really great email and said, "I'm fascinated to see you coming in this direction into the digital, because I've been using your courses to step into the story side of things."
Cool.
And it made me think, in like having a good exchange with him, that I think this is why like the classic storytellers of science fiction have kind of become famous again and relevant again after a kind of lull. So people like Robert Heinlein or Ursula Le Guin, they never stopped being famous, but they've been rediscovered by a lot of people because we have all these digital worlds, and we can spend a lot of time on video games and they look amazing. And I was very tempted to just drop everything that I was doing and put Unreal Engine on my computer and spend like 6 months learning to use it. But it's exactly that thing, that at the end of the day, there is some need for story and meaning at the end of all this. And it's people like Heinlein, for instance, who, although he didn't see the digital technology coming directly, but those people were thinking into where we are now. So I've just done an episode on Philip K. Dick, and Philip K. Dick was mostly writing his classic work in the 60s, but it's all like prophesying where we actually are at the moment and telling stories that are relevant to it. So I think if you pick up Philip K. Dick's short stories today, they're probably more comprehensible than they were when they were written, because now all of these things have actually come into our existence, all from the wonderful world of science fiction, you know?
I love that episode. That's my favorite episode, I think, by far. I love that you called him a prophet in the more general sense, right? And discussed that it's not just that he predicted things, it's that he channeled the word of God, and not in a direct sense necessarily. I mean, he has this whole thing with Valis and all of that, but in the sense of whatever God means, or whatever some higher power meaning, he was involved in trying to give us the meaning to the events that we're now living through, and it's quite prescient and amazing.
Yeah. It was a fun episode to record, and I'd had that one in the back of my head for a long time. A lot of these episodes now are just stuff that I've been thinking about for 20 years.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, I'm going to finally do that episode on 2001 that I've been thinking about since I was 6 when I saw 2001.
Or the Jungian archetypes of the Matrix. That was another one that I think had a lot of intellectual firepower behind it. It was really great to hear you describe what's going on in the Matrix that way.
Yeah, thank you. I just fascinated by those as a storyteller, almost as a hack for storytelling, because once you know the archetypes, you just start seeing them everywhere. But I'm never sure whether I'm projecting them there. You know?
Well, if I could go back to this list, it was. You just said that you wish you had included more digital artists. I think you included an amazing amount of very, diverse artists that I've never heard of, and it was really eye-opening to me. I mean, we started as a book club, so we talk about a book every month, and we read a book together, and we're up to speed on the authors. And I think it's a really interesting list. If I could just sort of say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You only had 8 authors, science fiction authors, I think, in this list of 21. And moving from the 21st to the 1st, you had John Scalzi, Jin Liu. Sorry, I don't know how to say the first name. I was just tutored on that, but I screwed up. Tamsin Muir, who I think of as a fantasy author, but she was on there at 17. N.K. Jemisin, which we love. We just did an episode about her. I've reread her stuff recently. And then Charlie Jane Anders, Quantum, Becky Chambers, and Ted Chiang. So that's a pretty, I don't know, I don't want to call it eclectic, but these are not the most famous authors of science fiction, right? These are really newcomers. They're really people who are kind of changing the format. I mean, Becky Chambers especially, I think of as someone who's really modified what we consider as the space opera, for example. Right? We've been reading Elizabeth Bear's new space opera, and there's a lot of interest in space opera these days, but it doesn't look like the space opera I'm familiar with from when I was a teenager, right? And a lot of it's being written by women. A lot of it is focused on it's not the space battles anymore. It's the empathy, and it's inclusion, and it's the family, the chosen family, right? Story in space.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of what science fiction is becoming and where it came from. And my kind of working thesis is that, science fiction for a long time had this, I would say, like a bit of a chip on its shoulder about its general status in the wider society. But if you look from like 2000 onwards, and there's definitely seeds of it before then, science fiction, which I use in a pretty broad way, I include fantasy in it and just anything. John Clute, the critic, has this term fantastica that just includes all of this stuff. And that bracket of things, science fiction, is the mainstream of culture now. That's what we talk about online. It's what we spend our time doing in video games. But as it does that, it's taking like the high ground of the culture is also making more sophisticated and diverse what science fiction is. So it's becoming more global. I spent quite a lot of time this year reading new Indian authors of science fiction and thinking about what they're going to be bringing into this kind of cultural space, becoming more diverse. So you have a whole kind of subculture of Black science fiction and Afrofuturism, which has all its own ideas and kind of a much different political emphasis. There's going to be, I think there's 3 adaptations of Octavia Butler coming, which I'm very excited for because she was just an amazing writer and a storyteller. And I'm rereading her books at the moment. I'm reading many of them for the first time.
Well, the graphic
so I
novel.
think it's
the graphic novel adaptation just won the Hugo, right? For Parable of the Sower.
Oh, sure. I didn't even spot that in the Hugos. I actually didn't pay much attention to the Hugos this year. Yeah, and so this is like a shift from science fiction having a self-image of being about the space battles to now science fiction being where we have these kind of complex, subtle, sophisticated conversations about what's going on in our society. So it tended to pick the authors for this list who were in that direction. And that's always been my personal preference as well. But like the most nominated author, when I first put that list out, people said, "Where's Peter F. Hamilton?"
Right.
And I just had to say, I've enjoyed some of his books, but I don't think that's the significant direction of where science fiction is going now. And Peter F. Hamilton has told me off in the past for saying that about his books. But.
Good enough reason there.
That's a feather in your cap. Yeah.
You mentioned it's like that's hard sci-fi has sort of been repeating itself. What are some of the ideas that you're tired of seeing in that side of the genre?
Well, yeah, I mean, things get very controversial with the hard science fiction authors here. So if we look at and you can talk to Kim Stanley Robinson more about this. He was interviewed in the Science Fiction Talks Club on Clubhouse, and I was chatted with him a bit in there. Just to plug that group, it's a really great group. He said in there, he reiterated what the message he had made in Aurora, his book on a generation starship, that he doesn't believe we're ever going to go to the stars. We're stuck in the solar system, and we're probably not even significantly going to colonize the planets. There's just no upside to doing that. That's Kim Stanley Robinson's argument, and I tend to agree with that. And I think what hard science fiction has done is not look at that bottom line. So if I make that argument, my hard science fiction friend says, "No, you're just ignorant of the engineering. We will go there. It's just an engineering problem." So I think hard science fiction is actually kind of wrestling with the fact that it's actually a bit of a fantasy what it's putting into the world. So whereas the reality of what we're looking at in the future, I think, is being much better expressed initially by cyberpunk, and now by authors who are kind of looking at things like solarpunk, because the real question is, how do we live on a planet that we might be on for another 10,000 years in quite a similar situation to the one that we're in now? Maybe our technological progress actually kind of taps out around this point. That's an interesting thing to speculate on. And then the question is, what do we do for the next 5,000 years if things don't change significantly? And I actually think that's the more interesting question for science fiction now.
Well, we hang out inside video games, right?
Yeah, that's what we're going to be doing, isn't it? Yeah.
It's inner space rather than outer space, I think, is the way that you phrased it.
Yeah.
Well, on that topic there, I feel a lot of people read science fiction not to get a prediction of the future, but kind of. You hear people all the time saying, "Hey, they didn't predict the future right. Hey, we're living in the year that this was supposed to be, and look how different, they didn't get it right." Should we be reading science fiction to find out what the future looks like? Or, I mean, I don't do that personally, but I find science fiction is the catalyst for ideas. Whether the exact idea is similar to what the the creator creates that's not important. We're definitely getting, like you said, the classic authors are getting more popular again. It doesn't matter if they got it right or wrong. And I kind of want to hear all of us here. Why do we read science fiction? Where is it going? Are we trying to predict something, or are we all trying to just squeeze out these ideas to figure out where we're going next, regardless of the technology or the predictions being true? But Damien, why do you think we are reading science fiction and so interested in it right now?
Yeah, I think you see a kind of split in culture. I don't know what the total number of people who read science fiction are, but they're very focused around technology industries, of course, scientific research. If you speak to anyone kind of making significant movements there, they read science fiction. I can't think of a single person who said, I don't read science fiction, but I'm a tech entrepreneur,
Exactly.
And if you read science fiction, you probably saw cryptocurrency coming. You've seen virtual worlds coming, and you see the downsides of them. So it's clearly a very useful guide, but it's not a guide in terms of like literal predictions. And kind of during the time that I was like writing for The Guardian, and it's still kind of stuck back in this space, really. You have the period where science fiction is just ignored. And then you get some think pieces about it saying, oh, look, Star Trek predicted the mobile flip phone. And you're like, well, okay, that's a step forward, but that's not really what science fiction is doing. We're not just trying to predict the actual technologies that are going to come forward. Not to over-aggrandize science fiction, maybe, but I think science fiction is where we invent the future. It's where the ideas are coming from that we then kind of shape our efforts towards. And you see that, very clearly in like someone like Elon Musk. Like Elon is the guy who had the science fiction dreams and is annoyed that they're not happening. So he's just going to make them happen. I will land the space rocket. I will take us to Mars, give us the batteries and the electric cars. And we need some kind of inspiration for that. And science fiction is where the actual dreams and inspiration come from. That's how I see it.
We did a panel with the science fiction author Carl Schrader at a fan expo, and he says that the reason that Elon Musk is so hell bent on going to Mars is that he's read too much science fiction, and he says really if he's actually intent on colonizing in our solar system, there's better places than the surface of Mars, and he's actually talking about floating cities in the atmosphere of Venus, and I'm not sure that that's actually more practical, but that's what Carl was saying. But yeah. I 100% agree that it totally forms decision making and what we grow up with and what we think is cool. But also let's look at how science fiction authors describe themselves. Just of the folks that we've interviewed, Cory Doctorow, Carl Schrader, David Brin, they all call themselves futurists and science fiction authors. So they're saying quite clearly that we are thinking about the future, and maybe not predicting, but certainly conceptualizing.
And David Brin, actually, I thought it was really interesting. He has this tagline, or I think a book he's written about Hollywood right now, that says, listen, science fiction has already saved the world like 6 or 7 times. Science fiction is not only where we dream up the next thing, it's where we maybe more importantly, we warn the world about the problems, right? We like the warnings of Dr. Strangelove and so there's a whole long list of Hollywood movies you can come up with, right? That like highlighted this possibility in the future that became part of the popular consciousness. And people really took it to heart and started thinking about these issues in a way that they wouldn't have thought of if they hadn't been exposed to this science fiction work.
And there's also a lot of escapism in sci-fi. It's usually always a fun adventure that we all want to disappear into. So it's one of the most important parts of science fiction, I would say, is simply escapism. But that's
unless
also
it's a Peter
fantasy.
Watts book. If it's a Peter Watts book, you don't want to escape into it.
No, you don't want to get in a Peter Watts book.
Well, Kevin, we will.
Or an N.K. Jemisin book, for that matter.
Yeah, that's grim too. Well, it's funny you brought up Aurora, because that book shook me in a way when I realized that, I really bought into what what Kim Stanley Robinson was talking about there. He said, no, we don't get the Earth is it. And then, I mean, a lot of his books afterwards take this environmental track, and so we're reading 2312 this month, and it's been a bit of a slog. But his universe that he creates, this world that he's created, is all about how we live within our solar system, but everything falls back to Earth, right? Like everything gets tied back to our connection to Earth and our inability to truly leave our home planet behind. It's in getting back to these ideas of like hard science sort of selling us ideas that are probably kind of fantastical. Like, I think that's a really good point to make, and something that we don't think about as much, like what's realistic. And when you look at hard science ideas, are there hard science ideas that you like?
Oh, I mean, I love the ideas personally, and I try to have these discussions to sometimes take the devil's advocate side, because I think what we've been doing in hard science fiction is too balanced one way. But I would love it if we could build a generation starship. I've been reading Poul Anderson recently, actually, because I'm trying to find a science fiction novel that I read when I was about 12 about a starship exploring a number of star systems, like the interstellar setup. But there were many of these written, and I can't find the exact one that I found then. But I have read a fantastic Poul Anderson novel this year, and all of the ideas about like the different forms that life will take, I think they're really essential to where we are, and we might not find them like out on alien planets, but I think we're going to encounter like such alien life forms probably in the AI space that we will be meeting aliens anyway. So I think it's just the high invention of that thinking, and in a way I think the problem for hard science fiction has been not acknowledging the extent to which it is like the cutting edge of imagination, or losing sight of that by combining our scientific insight with our storytelling, what comes out of it is amazing. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the future or credible. The value of the imagination is still really great. We just have to not get too hung up on the reality of it. That simplified argument about hard science fiction is what I'm just trying to push back on a bit.
Poul Anderson, interestingly, is the father-in-law of Greg Bear.
Oh, yeah.
Little
I think I heard
trivia.
that somewhere. Yeah. Well, if you go to the Clarion Science Fiction Writers Workshop, it is a bit like you've arrived at the heart of science fiction. That was my feeling. Like I'd spent like 15 years trying to get there, and I'd finally arrived at science fiction in a physical place. And Neil Gaiman was there, but David Brin came and spoke to us, and like just a whole bunch of great people who live around San Diego as well. Kim Stanley Robinson, in fact, was one of them. You realize that this thing, science fiction, for most people, it's like the books that you're reading, but there is a core community of the creators who all know each other and have also been having their dramas and their relationships with each other. And there's probably a whole soap opera, probably like a chart-topping HBO series to make about the science fiction community itself, and like who married who, and what the factions are who've been arguing with each other for the last 40 years.
Can you tell us more about the Clarion Writers Workshop? Like, what exactly was that process about, and how did it go?
Yeah, that was interesting. I remember about a year before I applied for it, I learned about it online, and I thought, that's crazy. People go and they spend 6 weeks workshopping stories in San Diego, and literally I just thought it was a crazy thing to do. And then I'm a lifelong Neil Gaiman fan. In fact, a friend of mine visited me at my house some years ago when I was still living in the UK, and like he walked through my front door and took a look to his left and said, "Damien, you have a shrine to Neil Gaiman in your house," because I had like all of his books and graphic novels like up on the wall on their own. And it's true, I did. And I kind of grew up reading his comic books. So it was announced that he was going to teach, and like a lot of people, that made me apply. So I put in an application, put a lot of effort into doing the application, wrote a story specifically for it, and kind of waited on tenterhooks for 3 months or something, and then got an acceptance to it, and I was absolutely blown away. It was also the first time I traveled to America, to California. I kind of got on a flight and found myself in San Diego, which is so different to Leicester in the UK, where I was living at the time. So there was that whole aspect to it. And it was a great group of people as well. If for no other reason than you get to go and be part of a group of 18 people and the instructors and the foundation members who come and visit, and you get that experience. But it's a pretty brutal experience, because if you're a science fiction writer, we're doing stuff in our little bubble, and maybe you show it to your friends and family, you send it to magazines, you get some rejections, maybe you get an acceptance here and there. But you're going to go and be in a group of your peers, and they're very honestly, some very intelligent experts in science fiction are going to tell you what's wrong with what you're doing. And you're going to find yourself, as I did after the week one, curled up on your bunk bed, like in shock about what just happened to your... and that happened to everyone. There was lots of crying. I can see I'm not selling it at the moment. But
well, if only 18 people get in, then that might be a blessing for all the people that don't.
Sure, yeah. I think there were 300 people who applied that year, and it's a self-selecting group. But and I say that because why is it that so many Clarion Glads do go on and like publish their stories or have successful careers? And you look back at the history, and like Octavia Butler, Cory Doctorow, just with names you've already mentioned, it's partly because it is a self-selecting group of people who are already quite determined to do that. But also there's a real value to being in that community and doing the workshopping. And you learn more from actually looking at everybody else's stories. So you're reading 2 stories a day, writing notes on them, doing your own writing. So it is a boot camp for science fiction writers. And it's great to have because it's one of the bedrocks of our community. Really, you had the Science Fiction World Con, and you had the Clarion workshops and Science Fiction Writers of America as well. And that's kind of the fundamental that holds the science fiction community together in a way. So I recommend to people, if you get the opportunity to do it, go and do it. But you also don't have to do it. Neil Gaiman accidentally, one year we were promoting it afterwards, and he retweeted that I had said, you need to go to Clarion. And Neil said, yeah, you need to go to Clarion, but we didn't quite mean it in that way. And there was a huge Twitter storm of people saying, I can't afford to go. I will never be a science fiction writer. And of course, that's not the truth at all. But it's a great experience if you can get there.
Well, there's a lot to be said for pedigree, not pedigree, but mentorship, I guess, right? That you have these masters that you look up to, and to have them tell you anything, give you criticism or give you praise, I think goes a long way. Cory Doctorow in our interview mentioned, some praise he got from, anyone remember? I don't, someone at the Clarion, right? And that was like, whoa, this gave him the he'd been publishing for 15 years, like we're not publishing for 15 years. And then he had his breakthrough story, and that came from someone at Clarion. Actually, the first interview we had was with David Zindel. Do you know him? He's my favorite. Neverness is his.
He was a very famous YA writer for a long time, or still is.
Okay. I don't. Yeah. David Zindel. Maybe it's somebody else. But anyway, he went to Clarion.
Okay.
He workshopped one story. He published that story. Mm-hmm. I think it was Robert Silverberg that read it, in L. Ron Hubbard's new authors or whatever. He called him up and said, "Hey, you want a contract for a novel? Sure, there you go."
No, I think it was Gene.
The Gene Wolfe was his mentor from the workshop. He taught the
Oh, okay.
workshop, I think, the year he did that.
Wow. Yeah.
But anyway, one thing leads to another. You get these names, they encourage you, then you publish your great thing, then you get a contract to write a novel, and off you go. So it's very valuable, right, to have that kind of community.
There's nothing more ego busting but effective than peer review. It can be like you say, the tear inducing, but if you actually want to improve, that's the approach that you have to take. And for those of us whose egos are fragile, it's a difficult thing. And I put up my hand as being part of that crowd. But yeah, it's great idea.
It's like martial arts. You got to get beaten up to get better at it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They got to break you before they can build you up again.
That's right.
Boot camp.
Does Neil Gaiman have like a weird hazing ceremony that you have to go through that you're not allowed to talk about?
No, I mean, Neil is because he's such an unusual figure in our community, because he's at a rock star level of fame when nobody else in the science fiction community is, but he's been at the heart of the community for his whole professional career, and he knows everybody, and he loves the science fiction community. Of course, he's known as a fantasy writer, but he could easily have written hard science fiction instead. That's in him as well. So, like, I reviewed his collection of non-fiction, like collected non-fiction, and I compared it to a collection by Cameron Hurley. So Cameron Hurley is like, a whole generation separated from Neil Gaiman, really, and a very different coming up through the internet as opposed to the print community that was there before. And they were two very different perspectives on what science fiction is, but both people who are totally in love with science fiction. So like Neil is by doing something like Clarion, he's in a way supporting it. He's raising its profile massively in that year, but he was incredibly generous as well. He's stayed in touch with, even after we're no longer in touch with each other, Neil still talks to all 18 people who are on the course, and continues to mentor and support people.
Well, he just seems like a grade A person. I mean, he's amazing, generous, kind.
It's very difficult to even in our very angry Twitter driven times, even Twitter has only occasionally shouted at Neil for things he's said, and they shout at everyone else much more.
I kind of want to do a hard left turn here and just go to your list for a second, Damien. I'm looking at Hans Zimmer here.
Hans Zimmer,
and let's just talk about him for a minute. I'm a fan of music and score. Obviously, in the last 20 years, he's just become the master of the greatest, some of the greatest films of the last 20 years. Why does he make it on the list for science fiction? Is it because he just he scored some really good science fiction films, or does he go beyond just the films he scores? And is it more because Hans is definitely a character and an important person in he's an important artist. So tell me a little more about Hans and why he's on your list.
There was this period in the 1970s, early 70s, where you had a lot of really interesting, edgy science fiction movies, like Rollerball, which is one of my favorite ever sci-fi movies, like James Caan and all of that kind of thing. And it was very interesting, and it drew a lot of ideas from science fiction authors. And then basically you hit Star Wars, and you have like 30 years of blockbuster sci-fi cinema because of Star Wars. But that has kind of trended back the other way, and we've got Denis Villeneuve and Christopher Nolan and others as well, making again like really interesting high concept science fiction. And then you look at their films, and it's all Hans Zimmer. He scores all of those science fiction movies, basically, and then you try and dig into why that is. And my thinking is that Hans Zimmer took a lot of influences, including some experimental influences like John Cage or something from around the turn of the century. And you see this in all art forms, that what is experimental some decades later has become the mainstream. And Hans Zimmer is like the point that happens. And it also just becomes the sound of science fiction is those blaring horns from Batman, or the general kind of dark ambient noises that he's put into Chris Nolan and Denis Villeneuve's movie making. So he's kind of the sound of what science fiction storytelling has become, both because he's been successful at it and also because of like the theory he brings into music is actually in some way just very much of our times and of our culture now. And I will happily sit and listen to the Blade Runner 2049 soundtrack, the Dune soundtrack now, particularly. It's just amazing pieces of music.
I had to. I was almost disappointed with the Dune when I first heard it, because I heard this awesome percussion. I was like, "Oh my god, this is great!" And then it kind of goes minimal, and then it's growing on me. But Hans has a way of making minimalist classical very accessible to people today, especially when Interstellar came out. It almost sounded like Philip Glass, who I'm also a fan of. It was very minimalist, modern classical. So I'm just happy to see him on your list. I thought that was great to see Hans Zimmer in your list, because and he's also another rock star of he's the rock star of film scores now. So great to see him on the list. Yeah.
Well, now
I actually have a pet theory that actually blockbuster science fiction cinema, they're really just pop videos for the music of Hans Zimmer or John Williams or any of these other composers as well. Because there's a great, like, it was a viral YouTube video of the Star Wars, the final scene from Star Wars, where they're given the medals and they take the music away from it, and it's completely surreal, the entire scene. And I will sit and listen to a playlist of John Williams Star Wars tracks, maybe when I'm writing something. So I'm going to do this as a YouTube video at some point, maybe get my first properly viral YouTube video with that one. Yeah.
Well, I thought that was very mind-opening, when I would never even have considered, composers and musicians on a list of top 21 science fiction influences, storytellers. But it made me realize, oh yeah, they're storytellers, right? They are telling the story, helping tell the story, but also shaping the story. It is their medium for storytelling that we should appreciate more. And we have to ask you now, since we've almost touched on Dune a number of times, tell us about Dune. What do you think? How'd it go?
Oh, wow. So, I mean, I'll share with you that because I was on a deadline, I watched a torrent of Dune, which was a terrible idea the first time I watched it. And it was literally like being interrupted by advertisements from like an illegal Hong Kong casino who had put the rip onto the internet. And that would come up like every 10 minutes. So I think that spoiled my initial appreciation of Dune, although I did think it was good. But then I was able to get a proper copy of it, and I watched that. And the second viewing, I was just absolutely mesmerized and blown away by that film. And I have a long history with Dune because I watched the David Lynch version far too many times when I was a kind of lock-in teenager who would just watch VHS sci-fi movies over and over again. And that was like my number one sci-fi movie, again, partly because of the music as well, which is, I forget the name of the ambient musician now. And, what I really felt with Dune is that it was like this world of science fiction. There's a word that sci-fi fans use, sense of wonder, like the sense of wonder that you get from science fiction. And I'd only really experienced it in books. And actually that was the first time I'd ever really seen it captured on a screen. Like the moment where Paul's walking over the cliffs of Caladan and the spaceship they're going to go in comes out of the sea, which totally makes sense because it's a spaceship. It can survive different atmospheric pressures, And just so many touches like that. And Denis Villeneuve is clearly one of my fellow sci-fi nerds who also spent too much time thinking about this stuff as a teenager. So he's got all of this great visualization. And he's put it all onto screen. He's mastered the technologies to do that in a way that I think very few other cinema directors have. and you can see his passion for it as well. And he's got a big team of people who are passionate about it as well. And when you get that, that makes something very special. So I think Dune is one of those special things. I hope part 2 can continue that, and we get like a coherent 5.5-hour version of Dune, which I think is about the right length for that book. What did you guys think? Are you all fans, or were there any haters?
I think we're all fans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're all fans
The
here.
better question is who's a fan of the David Lynch, because I don't think
Yeah,
anyone
yeah.
these guys don't like the David Lynch, and
No.
I think I'm the only one that truly loves that one still.
Well, it's a great David Lynch movie and a very poor Dune adaptation.
Yeah,
in many
yeah,
ways. Yeah.
and I'm fine with those voiceovers, and I figured there wouldn't be any with the Villeneuve, but you can add them in there, and I have no problem, because when I read that book, I heard the voiceovers just like the David Lynch movie. So, but I get that why they weren't in there. It cheeses the whole film up.
Yeah, Villeneuve definitely did not do a cheesy version of Dune, and I really appreciate that. Like, it was exactly what you said, sense of wonder. It was sense of wonder from the beginning to the end, not only visually but musically, right? For me now, the soundtrack of science fiction is Tibetan Buddhist chanting, apparently, right? It's these voices, and it just takes you up and down and up and down and up and down. Like, I felt like I was put through a ringer by the time I got out. But the most amazing part of that experience for me was that I took my children to see Dune in 3D at the movie theater, and they loved it, right? Like, and I mean, I've been talking science fiction to them since they were that big, and it's just like, oh yeah, that's Dad's project, I don't care, whatever. They now have a chip on their shoulder about science fiction because there's so much of it in my house. But this did it, right? This brought them around. They're like, in the middle of the movie, my 10-year-old looked at me like, Dad, this is amazing. Like, wow. So, I think it was a different level of storytelling. We see a lot of movies. We see a lot of superhero movies. We see a lot of superhero movies in their lifetime. And so this really sort of changed the cinematic experience for them. For me, it was almost like a psychedelic experience, just being there, taking it in. It was not the same curve, narrative curve that you find in other works. And I thought it really captured, the spirit of Dune really well, the actual book.
Yeah, it really got the darkness and the horror of that world as well.
Yeah.
That scene with the Sardaukar, where you hear the chanting that you've heard in the credits, and it cuts in. Somebody actually did a Twitter meme, and they gave you the exact time to start playing that on New Year's Eve, so that the chanting would hit at midnight exactly. So that's become like an online meme. And you just in the background of that scene, you see that they're like blood sacrificing all of the Sardaukars who hadn't made it through the training and weren't going to go and fight. At least that's the story I've told about it. And it's that kind of little detail in the background, which the film is full of, that really helps as well.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, as I understand it, he had been storyboarding that for years, right? Like, this is something he's planned and wanted to do, and finally had the opportunity to do. So, the passion and the thought behind it is obviously years in the making. So I feel like that's why a lot of this is his vision coming to fruition, lends it a lot of credibility. And me too. When I saw it, it was, it was one of the first movies that I had seen in theater for a long time. But B, I was able to bring my son as well, and for him, similar to Marty, it was a very different experience. Everything was big, right? All the scenes were big, the music was big, the costumes were all big, and so that experience, more than anything, the emotions of it was very noteworthy. So for me, that's why I thought it was excellent. Absolutely loved it.
Well, the nice thing that can be said about the Lynch version is that we get Tristan's imitation of Patrick Stewart out of that, and that might be worth it. That might be worth it alone.
Oh, you're muted. We can't hear you. Do it.
Oh, I'm not doing it.
Oh, come on.
Oh, young pup. That's terrible. I don't do it actually well.
No, we should get Damien to do it. He's actually got the right accent. All right, I
I
know we've
think
had you for a while, but
yeah,
can we also ask you about The Matrix as a counterpoint, probably, to Dune?
sure, yeah.
What'd you think of
Yeah.
that?
Well, someone, a member of the group, Carla Ra, I'm going to steal her talking point about it because she nailed it down, which is that she said that one of the creators of The Matrix made a Matrix fan fiction, and then it got accidentally put into cinemas, which I I think is the best way of understanding that movie. Because if I think of it as a fan fiction and it's like a meta commentary on the Matrix and the experience of being one of the people who made the Matrix, and it's probably trying to escape the Matrix in their life as well. A lot of the movie makes sense. So I sat and watched it with that mindset, and I was like, "There's a lot to like in here." And the other 50% of me went, "I want a better gunfight. I want to see some ballistic people shooting guns at each other with some Rage Against the Machine music in the background," which it didn't satisfy that half of my need from a Matrix movie at all. So I understand both kind of takes on it as well. And there's definitely a very relevant political theme in The Matrix because it is a movie about awakening, and we have a culture that is, I don't know if it's the same in Canada at the moment, but is obsessed with woke culture at the moment. And so many of the things that like culture war thing is about, the people who both are woke and are anti-woke, who I think, just to get myself in trouble with everybody, I think they're both kind of as crazy as each other on both sides of the argument. But the Matrix is about all of the things that they're talking about, and it was about that 20 years before that kind of burst back into the culture. Yeah, I studied a lot of postmodern philosophy at university as part of media, which I was studying, and then I forgot it all. And then 3 or 4 years ago, it just kind of burst into the internet again, and everyone is talking about the stuff I thought had been kind of proven irrelevant when I was at university thinking about it. And here it is in the culture, and everybody is talking about this again. And so the Matrix could have maybe, I don't know, done more with that as well. So as well as being a bit of a disappointment as an action movie, it was, even the intelligent parts didn't really hit the bar that they could have. So ultimately I'm critical of it. But also I felt like some kind of need to defend it because I could see there was a lot of intelligent things happening in there. And the general critique of it, that it was like, oh, it's just awful and trash, I think were far too simplistic. My take there, my take.
I don't understand the trash people are giving it either. I've since watched it twice, and I went into it hearing that it was terrible, and then even for the folks that were saying, for the early reviews that were saying it was really boring, I didn't know what was going on, and then the second half it really picked up and kind of got going. That was the exact opposite of my experience. And it was probably because I lowered my expectations so much going into it. I went into it thinking this is going to be a stupid movie. They're going to ruin all of my dreams. And I actually truly enjoyed it. I think I get sensitive to film sometimes, and probably because the Matrix is so close to my heart, because I saw that as a young man, and it kind of changed the way I see things a little bit, and we can all kind of say that at least a little bit. The first 10 minutes I almost had a tear, like when Morpheus said he's looking for Neo, and then I think Bugs says I am too, and they connect. I was like, oh my god, this is freaking perfect. And then again, when Neo was in the real world, and he's asking his questions like, what's going on here? How did you get me out? And one of the machines that works with him comes up and rests his head on Neo's. I had a tear. I said, this is what I want. This is what I want. These connections. This is what I want. And then I did find the second half just was about getting Trinity out and the two of them and their love. And I get that, but it didn't. the second half is supposed to blow my mind, and the end is supposed to blow my mind, and that's what I didn't quite get with this new Matrix. But like Damien, you said, I will defend this movie to no end, because you can't. Something I hear a lot from these critics is this movie should not have been made. Well, that's just a silly thing to make. If someone's going to make art, it's not up to you to say it shouldn't have been made. It doesn't matter how important the Matrix is to you. The person that created this story, Lana Wachowski, she came in and made another one. Like, give me a break. Like, that's her art, and she's allowed to have that. I'm also a little bit surprised that David Mitchell helped write the screenplay, because I love Cloud Atlas, the film and the book. The book is one of my favorite books. I'm surprised that he wrote the screenplay, because I didn't see too much of him in the script, but I definitely saw aspects of Cloud Atlas in the editing and in the film itself.
You mentioned David Mitchell, who's just someone I'm always happy to have mentioned. And when I did the podcasts about the sci-fi list, I kind of added him to my list along with China Miéville as well. Because
nice.
I think David Mitchell particularly is like, I did an interview with him, actually an email interview. So that was some years ago now, specifically about his background in science fiction, because he's one of those writers who's not categorized as science fiction, but clearly all of the ideas of sci-fi and fantasy and horror are there in his work. And he was a Dungeons and Dragons nerd growing up.
Oh, awesome!
You know, and then just he's. I think, you know, if you can be pigeonholed as a literary author, that's a good thing to be pigeonholed. So he was pigeonholed there, but a lot of his thinking comes from sci-fi and fantasy. But he is, and I don't want to offend any other writers who I write about, but he's just categorically a level above as a fiction writer than I think anybody else working at the moment. And if you read like Ghost Written and Cloud Atlas and Number 9 Dream, they're just such spectacular pieces of fiction writing, and the way he takes you into the consciousness of the characters. I would love to be able to write like David Mitchell. If I could just pick a writer that I could write like, it would be him.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear, Damien, because I haven't read enough of his work, but enough to know that he's of a different caliber. He's pure literature, and somehow can write science fiction. Did you feel David Mitchell as a part of the creation of this new Matrix movie?
Yeah, no, it's a brilliant question. No, I have to agree with you that I don't. Maybe some of the stuff around Keanu Reeves' character, when he's just kind of, he's stuck as the video game designer. That's not spoilers, really, is it? I think it's the beginning of the film. And you could imagine him being a David Mitchell character, like the interior narration of his state, and he's kind of turning up to the office every day and wondering what the nature of his existence is. That's quite David Mitchell. But Mitchell's writing is so much about the interior of the characters that it's hard to identify in a film script, which is very exterior, what his contribution would have been to that. I'd love to see him do like a solo script at some time. I have lost, I haven't been paying attention to know if he has done that or not yet, but yeah, that would be good to see. It's very rare for anyone to be very good as a novelist and very good as a screenwriter.
Right.
They're different crafts in the end.
Well, I'm just. I assume you liked Cloud Atlas, the book, but the film also. You appreciated that. You liked the film.
I think it struggled a little bit because David's stuff is so interior as the characters are transitioning through the different timescapes there, that you don't have to struggle with the slight shock of seeing the actors become different people, which is a struggle in the movie, I think. So
well, I thought
yeah,
that was the best part of the movie for me, because I thought that really allowed filmmaking to use its particular strength, because it was sort of in the book that these are continuous characters being reincarnated through different times, but you never really knew which character was which. And suddenly in the movie, like you could see it. You could just see it in a way you almost can't do in a novel, and that's kind of what I loved
Sure.
about the movie. I have to add one thing about The Matrix, which was my Facebook review of The Matrix, which was that it was a story about hippies getting old, right? Like it's kind of right. That's what happens. That you have your revelatory moment, you have your enlightenment at age 25 or 20, right? And all that stuff happens, and then life goes on, and you got to keep making money, and you lose it, and it's sort of Peter. And this is exactly what The Matrix was about, right? This experience of getting older and still finding yourself alive and kind of mundane, even though you had amazing enlightenment experiences in your youth. They don't last your whole life, and I don't know if they did a good job of that ultimately, but that's what I got out of it. And it's kind of a sad moral, but I thought, I haven't seen that anywhere else really portrayed that way because of the culture and the history of The Matrix, us having grown up with it. Like, this is our generation's story. And now we get to revisit that story 20 years down the road and feel kind of like Neo being a video game designer, selling his story. It's kind of sad, but it's pretty true to life. Right?
Yeah, that's a brilliant insight. Actually, I think that is the real text of the film, because after they've liberated Trinity and they're both in their goth clothes, basically, and they do have the look of people in their 50s who have put their clothes back on from their teenage years. Or you've probably got some friends who like never stopped wearing their goth outfit and they're still in them in their 50s, and it's fine, to do that, but also we're older and we're not 20 anymore, and but
I feel like Neil Gaiman still like dresses like that, doesn't he?
True. And he would concede that, I think.
And he does it well.
For the listeners who want to find your content, Damien, can you just tell folks how to find your podcast and your Facebook group?
And your webpage.
If you Google Damien Walter, there's just me and a guy who is also a parkour Hollywood stuntman. So obviously it's easy to confuse the two of us.
It's your alter ego?
Yeah, he's a great guy. He lived up the road from me, actually.
Oh, wow.
At the time as well.
That's weird.
It was weird indeed. So you can just Google Damien Walter. You go damiengwalter.com, and the podcast episodes and my courses are on there. You can join the Facebook group and get into our arguments. Just search science fiction on Facebook, and then look for the group that looks coolest, and it'll be our one.
I like that. Awesome.
Thank you very much for inviting me on, guys. This has been a real pleasure. I hope maybe we can do something else again in future, or maybe if I'm in the Americas for a convention at some point, be able to meet up with some of you.
Hey, that would be amazing. Yeah,
that would be excellent.
It is our goal in life to go for beers with everybody we talk to. So let's
nice.
do that. Yeah.
Nice.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much, Damien. That was a lot of fun. We'll probably connect again in the future for sure. All right, check out DamienGWalter.com. You're going to love the podcast. He does an excellent job. Next week, Sue Burke is on the show. Please leave us a review wherever you're listening to us. We'd love to hear how good we're doing, how bad we're doing. Thank you for listening to us today. Until next time.